11 days later, on December 22nd, Churchill flew into Washington for a third meeting with Roosevelt. For the next 3 weeks, the president played host to a unique house guest.
When Winston Churchill came to the White House, it was almost like a whirlwind having arrived. First of all, he would stay up until 2 a.m., drinking brandy, smoking his cigars. Roosevelt would stay up with him and be so exhausted because he'd have to get up at 9 in the morning or 8 in the morning to run the country, and Churchill could take a nap for hours if he wanted to.
FDR lived by what he called the Winston hours during those intense days, and though the pace was exhausting for Roosevelt, it was also exhilarating. No sooner, for instance, had Roosevelt seen Churchill's mobile map room than he wanted one of his own, so that he too could visualize the progress of the war. For Eleanor, it was all a bit too much.
My grandmother was just amused and a little bit taken aback by the enthusiasm of these two boys pushing their ships around as if they were in the bathtub with toy boats.
This first wartime summit became known as the Arcadia Conference. It was a time for the military chiefs of both nations to establish procedures for jointly running the war. The Combined Chiefs of Staff Committee was formed, under which intelligence was shared, campaigns coordinated, and strategic goals unified. Never before or since have two nations worked so closely in time of war. Arcadia ended on January 14, 1942, with the decision that Germany would indeed be the principal focus of Allied attack. Roosevelt now faced the greatest challenge of his political life, to galvanize a nation for war and chart a course toward victory.
We must raise our sights all along the production line. In this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes. Next year, 1943, we shall produce 125,000 airplanes, including 100,000 combat planes. Let no man say it cannot be done. It must be done, and we have undertaken to do it.
It would be the beginning of the largest military buildup in world history. But America's transition into war was neither easy nor without controversy. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Eleanor would find herself in passionate disagreement with the president. Their dispute centered on an order issued by FDR that forcibly uprooted more than 100,000 Japanese Americans and imprisoned them in distant internment camps. Throughout California, Japanese American homes and businesses were burned as retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor. West Coast governors demanded they be rounded up and sent to detention camps for the duration of the war. A week after the Pearl Harbor attack, Eleanor traveled to California to show solidarity with Japanese Americans. For weeks, the administration debated whether these Americans should be interned. Eleanor was vociferous in stating her position.
Eleanor Roosevelt was absolutely adamantly opposed to internment. She considered internment unconstitutional, unnecessary, unethical, stupid, and dangerous politics. All those words she used in various forms.
However, as the hysteria grew, the president felt he had to address public fears over the possible infiltration of Japanese saboteurs. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. Within a year, 110,000 were sent to relocation centers. Most spent the next 3 years behind barbed wire.
I had just finished kindergarten, and on May 1st, the soldiers came with their rifle and bayonet and marched us little kids to the truck.
The Okimoto family was rounded up in the spring of 1942 and sent from San Francisco to the Poston relocation camp built on an Indian reservation across the Arizona-California border.
My little brother was 2 weeks old, and we arrived in Arizona, and it was in the hottest time in that desert. The temperature goes up to 115, 120 sometimes. It was a barren desert. Because there were 6 of us, we were assigned to a room that was 20 by 24 feet. Just a room with a light bulb, cots, and we had to use a public latrine in the middle of the block, and that's where we lived for 3 years.
The internment of Japanese Americans lasted until November of 1944. 40 years later, President Ronald Reagan formally apologized to the internees. He embraced the finding of a presidential commission that said the policy of internment was militarily unjustified, that it resulted from race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. But in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the civil rights of Japanese Americans weren't a priority for a president focused on victory.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe.
By the summer of 1942, American industry was proliferating weapons of war, matching and even exceeding Roosevelt's ambitious challenge. Production plants were transforming the American workforce. The country had work for every able-bodied American.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor and go on to victory.
Rosie the Riveter became the mythical symbol enticing women into the workforce. In September 1942, the President and the First Lady undertook a rare trip together, a 2-week inspection tour that took them from Michigan to Minnesota, Washington, and California.
When Eleanor went on this trip, she felt an enormous sense of pride at looking at how many women were on the assembly lines, and she could see in their faces their sense of pride in their own work, the independence that they were experiencing. She even said, if I were of debutante age, she's now 57 at that point, there's nothing I would rather do than to be in a factory.
Although they met initial resistance, by the end of the war, nearly 2 million women were employed in defense industries. Now, Roosevelt had to assemble his military team. In 1913, his first job in Washington was as an assistant secretary of the Navy. Consequently, he felt he knew how the War Department worked and the kind of generals and admirals he needed to secure victory.
He was very careful in his selection of people, and he had a knack of picking people out and putting them in the right position, the first example of which would be General Marshall.
By picking George Marshall to be the Army Chief of Staff, Roosevelt had reached well down the military's chain of command. But he found an officer with broad strategic vision and composure under fire.
I don't think that there was anybody that Roosevelt more relied upon for the national security interests of the United States during wartime than George Marshall. Yet he was the only one of Roosevelt's generals or admirals that he didn't call by his first name. It was always General Marshall. Marshall didn't want to go to Hyde Park. He didn't want to be invited to dinner. He didn't want to have a personal relationship with the president.
But personal relationships were crucial to Roosevelt. The very nature of his disability restricted his access outside the White House. So a small group of friends were brought into his world.
Well, there's no question that for Roosevelt, having people around him was the source of his renewed energy. He needed to figure out ways to replenish that energy to face the struggles of the following day. Storytelling and conversations with people are his source of life and energy.
Many weekends during the war, he would secretly head north to Hyde Park. There he could be among friends, a time for cocktails, laughter, and inconsequential banter.
He loved gossip. He gathered people who knew things, not necessarily important things. But he liked to know what movie star was fooling around with what movie star. Things like that he loved.
Indeed, he had a simple rule with all these characters there, that there'd be a cocktail hour at night, and the only demand of that cocktail hour was you couldn't talk about the war, you couldn't talk about politics.
It was the one part of the day that was sacrosanct. Part of the ritual was that Roosevelt insisted that he act as bartender.
His martinis were not that strong. 2 to 1. Although he'd throw in a little gin at the end. Very careful measuring, and then right at the end, pour a little more gin in. He also put in 2 or 3 drops of absinthe, changing the taste of a martini to where many people, and it's recorded, say, the president made the worst martinis I've ever tasted.
Those sessions would keep the commander-in-chief going.